Designers and Builders, where design meets construction. We explore groundbreaking trends and talk to the pros reshaping our spaces. For your dream home, workspace, or just great design inspiration, subscribe to Designers and Builders.
Hey, welcome to today's brand new episode of Designers and Builders. I'm your host, Alyssa Olson, and today I'd like to welcome Dr. Diane Jones Allen. She's the Director and Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Texas at Arlington. She's a Principal Landscape Architect with Diane Jones. She's an ASLA Fellow, amongst other credentials, and all of the above. So how are you doing today, Diane?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here with you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. It's awesome to see you again. We connected recently at the American Society of Landscape Architecture conference in New Orleans. I had seen you featured in some video segments during a talk. I also know you gave a few of your own talks, but I was so inspired about you, the way you spoke about the beauty of landscape architecture and its impact. So hoping to get more into that today, your vast array of all the things you've been working on. But why don't we go ahead and start with your background? What led you to landscape architecture?
Well, as a kid, I was a Girl Scout forever. I grew up in the city. I grew up in Baltimore, but my father actually had come from the South. He had come from South Carolina, but he married a Northern woman. But actually, she was from Maryland, Eastern Shore. But anyway, and so like in our yard in the city in Baltimore, we had like all my father would grow, collards and corn in the middle of the city. He was, urban farming. My father was doing it way back in the 50s when I was a kid. Anyway, so that Girl Scouting and then, art, I like I said, my brother was a painter, so I always like art, and I ended up going to school in painting. I went to WashU. And even when I was in high school, I took classes at the Maryland Institute of Art, and I was in art honors. So I was a kind of visual creative person. But I realized, when I was in painting, especially, as a senior, like I had technical ability, but I didn't there wasn't like, as with some of the students, the other people that were seniors in art and that their major, they had this thing inside or this message or something that they really wanted to get out. And I really didn't have it. And that they told me that. They said, yeah, you have technical ability, but maybe you haven't lived enough or something. And my brother would say that. You always say you're not an artist unless you're making art, and you don't make it enough. And the drive isn't there, even though you have the technical ability. So I was going to go to school. I took a art history class at the Maryland Institute of Art, and I had this great in the summer. I had this great professor, and she was talking to us about art restoration. So I thought I would go to get a master's in art restoration, and so I applied for the GRE. I had to take it, and then I got this thing. I guess because I took the GRE from Harvard about this program they had called Career Discovery in the summer, that you could come and learn about the, environmental design disciplines. And then I discovered landscape architecture, and it just turned everything around. And I ended up taking a year off and volunteering with a neighborhood design center and at the city of Baltimore in urban design. And then I went to landscape architecture program at UC Berkeley. So it's funny because when I talk to people, and I would think that it would change, but when I talk to people much younger than myself and even my students, it's very rare you find someone who says, "Oh yeah, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a landscape architect." Usually they find it in this kind of circuitous way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of this hidden gem in the professional world. It's right there and it's all around us.
Yes.
Yeah, very cool. I love that. So, yeah, so you kind of grew up with it. There was the urban farming component, but then you started with the community process. And I feel like that's a really integral part of your work now.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you feel like
Yeah.
that? Yeah. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. Because that summer before I went to Berkeley, or actually that year before I went to Berkeley, because I took a year off in between. I worked. I volunteered really as an intern at the neighborhood design center, and which they got volunteers or designers volunteered their services to do community-based projects. And so that's where I was kind of introduced early to that concept. And I guess somebody growing up, in an urban environment, and seeing, all I think through my life, I've been I've been able, I could just say I have seen and lived at various economic ranges. So like, I had an understand of the needs of like communities through experience and through observation. Um
Wow.
so I, you know, I guess that kind of was always there. And that's one of the things I liked about landscape architecture. And then also like going to Berkeley, I can say this, Randy Hester was influential and it was kind of the right school to go to. You were, wanted to be immersed in thinking about community or, collective design. Yeah, that kind of practice of design. So I think that came early to me because of, yeah, the exposure I had through working at the Neighborhood Design Center, through going to UC Berkeley. Yeah.
Mhm.
And it kind of stayed with me, like the beauty of, and I like both. I guess the artistic side of me does like the creative process and making something beautiful, but also making something that, you know, has meaning and purpose, can change people's lives, and that you don't, which is very different from fine arts, where, it's about your creation. And if people like it, good. If they don't, who cares? I got it out of me. I like it. Where, and that's something I tell my students, that, yeah, we're not fine artists. We're a functional artist, right? And actually collaborative artists, right? Because as a designer, as a landscape architect, you're working with the client community, funder, user, to create this. And so you do have to kind of compromise, often aesthetics and all kinds of things. But I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it enriches the design, right? And the design process at that scale and scope takes so much time, so much energy. It evolves constantly as you go. So
Yes.
it is a completely different outcome. And it's in this built form, right? It's
Yes.
experiential.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. People live in it and they affect it. It's not like, a piece of art is done, kind of, but
Mhm.
landscape architecture is never done.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something I've been hearing a lot lately too, is the kind of the post occupancy observations from designers, is seeing the ways in which people use your spaces that you never imagined.
Exactly. I've had that happen many times.
Part of the fun, usually.
Yeah, because I just had an experience with that, and I was like, "Oh my gosh." But actually, it was really positive. I was like, "Yeah, I never thought to do that," but it seems to be working. They're using it totally opposite than the way I thought I designed it.
It's okay.
And I did engagement and walked around the site with these people, but after it was done, they were flipping the switch, and I was like, "Okay."
It's all right. So what was your connection? What led you from Berkeley to UT Arlington?
Oh, that was a long
Long
road,
time.
'cause I went, so when I left Berkeley, ended up, and sometimes I say, "Oh, I should have stayed in California," because I worked for Caltrans there when I was in the summer, and I had a job offer when I left, but I decided to go back to Baltimore.
Uh-huh.
And then when I was in Baltimore, well, this was really cool. I ended up working for Howard County Recreation, Howard County, Maryland. And really love that job because, and it's the other side of it, right? Like in those kind of jobs, usually consultants are hired to do, and the landscape architects are doing more like, kind of working to come up with what is the project going to be, and does it work with the zoning and outreach stuff, but then and RFPs usually put out. But it was exciting because, so I worked on, they were going to do this equestrian facility. So for 2 months, I rode horses. It was so neat because we had to mark out the trails. And then when I was there, they were also building Centennial Lake in Maryland. And so it was a man-made lake. So they had to dam a stream. And this is way back, so how old I am. So this is like the late 80s. And so we didn't really, like, we weren't using like Google Maps and Google Earth. So
Mhm.
we used to have to, or we didn't, I guess that stuff was starting, because that stuff started in the 80s when I was in Berkeley, GIS and all that was starting. But we didn't have drones. Okay, now what I was doing, you would have done with a drone. So back then, because we didn't have drones in 1988 or whenever it was, 86, you had to we would get in a small plane and fly over the area to take photos. And so I was doing stuff like that. And I thought that was really cool. But I ended up moving to New Orleans. And when I was in New Orleans, I had a lot of varied experiences too. I mean, that's the thing I love about landscape architecture. And I always tell my students, like, yeah, you can go work for a design firm. You should do that. But there's so many ways to practice landscape architecture. There's public practice, which I did. And and then when I was there, I worked for an engineering firm doing land planning, and we were doing South Shore Harbor, which was a marina. So, I worked on that an original master plan for the marina working for this engineering firm. And then after that, I worked for an architecture firm for 4 years. And then finally, I did my own practice, Terra Designs, about 1992. And then Katrina came and I ended up back in Baltimore. And then that's when I came to academia really late. I was a practice person. And it was because, life sometimes, I always say that none of this, as much as but you should plan. I'm not saying you should not have your plans and dreams. You should. But the reality is you should have your plans and dreams, but somebody else is making the plan. And for me, it's how you respond. So I always tell my students, especially my female students, get all the tools, like get your license, get your MLA, get a PhD if you can, get everything. You can, because it's really, you don't know how the journey's going to go, but you can control the response, right? If you're prepared. So I was lucky enough because I had an MLA when I was working for another land planning firm in Baltimore and Morgan State. I knew someone there, asked me would I come teach as adjunct, and I had never taught before. I never thought about teaching. My whole life, like I had a practice, that I had my own practice, because after I worked for the architect in New Orleans, I started my own practice, Terra Designs, which I have for about 11 years. And then Katrina came. But because I had the MLA, I said, okay, I'll try. I said, well, I'll teach an adjunct class at night. And I fell in love with it. And luckily, they had a tenure track position. So I left the firm and went to teach. Yeah. But because I had a license, I ended up starting Design Jones in 2009. I was at Morgan to 2014. Then I moved back to New Orleans, and I got married. I married another landscape architect, Austin Allen, was also a filmmaker. Who's really a brilliant person and has really shaped. I found him through going to a CELA conference, or we filmed him because actually he did a film and he had ASLA. So I actually thank ASLA for giving me my husband. Because he was looking for a landscape architect in New Orleans, and they said, oh, there's this person in New Orleans, go talk to her, for his film Claiming Open Spaces, which is a great film if you haven't seen it. Anyway, so yeah, so then, I ended up in academia and I taught at Morgan State, which is HBCU. And then I went back to New Orleans. And when I was in New Orleans, I just taught as a lecturer. At Morgan, I actually got tenure. Ended up being an associate professor, tenure track. Well, I was tenure track and I became tenured. But then when I left at LSU, I was just hired as a lecturer. I taught studios. And then one day I just got a call from somebody who mentioned that they had this director position in Arlington. And I thought they meant Virginia. I was like, Arlington. I never heard of Arlington, Texas. And so then when I got off, I was like, yeah, but I mentioned to Austin about it. And he said, Arlington's in DFW. That's a great place to, So he said, you should apply. And I said, yeah. And so I applied. And the rest is history. And this is my 9th year here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's been like, a journey. If you live long enough, you have a lot of things.
In looking at your body of work, I'm like, this is a few years here. This is not no sleep all the time, Yeah. So I guess a question that I am always curious about, because you balance professional practice and academia, is how do you balance that? What's kind of your ratio and the tack you take?
Yeah. And it's interesting, it's difficult. I mean, technically, like, I'm a full professor in the university. So with the university, I have an agreement. So I have a compliance agreement because, you want you to do research and they don't want you to bring in, taking. So I have an agreement that says, things that are research come through the university. But, built work kind of things, I have my own firm. So they're fine with that. And I have a compliance agreement that makes sure that those things stay separate. But so one thing helps is having a good person to work with. We have,
Mhm.
so Austin is also the other principal in the firm. And he kind of really oversees like the management, like getting the projects and then me, I basically oversee the design. I have really good people there that work with us. So I can like, whip things up on trace, or I collaborate with them on the design or oversee so I kind of work that kind of way. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what are some of your current professional projects?
Oh, like we have some really exciting stuff. So right now under construction, we have the Fred Rouse Memorial, which, we're hoping at the beginning of the year, we're hoping it's complete, but it's under construction now in Fort Worth. And so in 1921, Fred Rouse worked at the Smith Company. He was in a meatpacking plant and he went to work, but there was a strike. But at that time, African Americans could not be a part of the union. So he made the decision to go into work. And of course, the people striking considered him a union buster. And so when he came out of work, they beat him like to a pulp. They left him for dead, but the police picked him up. They came and picked him up and they pretended really that he was dead. And they put him in the back of the car and they took him to the hospital. And so, but unfortunately, a few days later, someone had told somebody in that mob. And so they came to the hospital and he was turned over and they took him and they lynched him on this site where we're putting the memorial.
Wow.
So, and it's an interesting story. It's being done by the Tarrant County Peace and Justice Coalition. And there actually was an article about this project in ASLA, and I was delighted that they just showed our drawings because it's not finished yet. Hopefully, it'll get back in when it's done. Anyway, so the Tarrant County Peace and Justice System, what they were connected with. There's the lynching memorial in Montgomery that Mass Design did, which is wonderful. And that memorial, that on those hanging pillars, their names, those pillars represent every county and the names of people that were lynched in the county. So Fred Rouse's name is there. And so somebody at Tarrant County Peace and Justice Coalition started doing research on him. And they found out that he had a grandson, Fred Rouse III. So they contacted him. And it turns out that Fred Rouse III knew nothing about his grandfather because he said that his father never talked about his father. And that's why. And so they had to prove to him, show him documents and things that this is your grandfather.
Cool.
Yeah. So he joined the coalition. And what's so wonderful is like, so we got the job to do it. They went through a process to find a landscape architect. And
Mhm.
because of the kind of work we have been doing, they like what we're doing. And so they hired us. And through the process, we presented, so we did community engagement, which was really important because, the community and these kind of things are really difficult. Like we did the Tamir Rice Memorial. And at one hand, yes, it's a painful thing and people, certain people, yeah, if it's your relative or your, like Miss Rice or, you want people to know this story. But and on the other hand, too, it's in a public space, right? So how do you get, to tell this story and also like heal and move on? So, so you're trying to do all these things and the thing like you're not just trying to tell this awful story, you're trying to think about the future, right? You want
Mhm.
people to learn, acknowledge, and move on, something positive to come out. And you're trying to do all that. So, in this case, so we had to present it to the city, and part of the entry that we had designed, we were hoping to get an easement because there was an adjacent piece of land that the city owned. Well, they liked the design so much, they actually just said, replat the land and you can have it. So the city donated a part of the land to the memorial. And then
Wow.
actually there's a site next to it that has a building on it. And the owner of that building said, if you, and the building is just like a blank flat wall, but it faces that side is like a big piece of our site visually. So they said, oh, you can put a mural on it, and make it part of your site. So people have embraced it. and, excited. And, actually they're the Tarrant Peace and Justice Coalition. So they were right with us, or we were with them in terms of, yes, this should also be about like, how do we, how do we learn and heal and have peace and, so there's a healing garden that we did, so as a landscape architect, like, so how do you, so when you come through like, the story of the site, you come into this healing and kind of contemplating piece where you can like, okay, think about, okay, so how do we not repeat these things and how do we, work as a community? So that's why we did engagement, because the community around there has to live with this, you know? Yeah, so we did engagement, and then we did 3 schemes, which we usually do. And then, of course, you end up with something that's usually not either of the schemes. It's, and often, I find, I have a colleague that kind of disagrees with me a little bit because they'll say, communities, which, they don't know, that we have the technical knowledge, which we do have the technical knowledge, but often their knowledge can shape our technical or things, because in one of the scheme that they chose, we had these runnels of water. And it was really, them thinking, well, that's expensive and what, they were worried about these runnels of water. And we thought, oh, these look, really cool. These runnels of water. But we ended up changing because they kept pushing back on it for like just like maintenance, safety, like a community, people would think, like a layperson would think, is my kid gonna fall in this runnel and drown? Or, how, it's really expensive to keep running this. So we ended up changing them to rain gardens because of that pressure. And it's so much better. It's about like the idea of sustainability, right? And water capture, and we put these green cells under, but that came because of the client pushing back on these fountains, really, these long, them pushing back and saying kind of practical things. And that really made us do something that had more meaning, really transformed and pushed the idea of, sustainability and resiliency and the future, kind of connected to like the moral themes. That's why, community input, as much as sometimes, it's a pain and you don't, but it really is important because it can really transform like a design and what you're thinking, it's like
Yeah.
2 minds are better than one, 20 minds are better than one,
You
Yeah.
not feel that way in the moment. Doing that this week, it's like, there's a lot that sits in this kitchen.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it amplifies that input and
Yes.
an outcome completely transforms. And I also love the narrative of the resilience, like the ecological and the social, and that kind of like the memory based in the landscape is all now tied together. It's
Yeah.
really
Yeah. And then I'll tell you one more because I know we don't have a lot of time. But this other project I'm really thrilled about, we just finished the master plan. And so we're waiting for like, because a lot of our work, because it is like grassroots, nonprofits, communities, they go slow. Like Fred Rouse, we started that in 2022. It's in construction. So, and somebody said, well, that's kind of fast. 3 years. I said, yeah, I guess it is. So this project, we finished the master plan. And so they're, trying to get funding so we can start like schematics and design development and really make it happen. Well, this project is in Dayton, Ohio, and it was an Olmsted site. So, Olmsted, Frederick Law, Olmsted. So it was one of the sites that he did. It was a seminary. So it's about 40 acres, I think, if I'm quoting that right. And so it was a beautiful seminary, and and it's set in the middle of, at the time a very well-off Dayton community. Um, and very Olmsted, oaks and maples, and it's got a ravine and rolling hills, very Olmstedian. And it had this lovely old seminary buildings that were on it. And so I don't know, I guess more than 10 years ago, it got, it kind of, the seminary closed and, started to deteriorate. And then this church bought it. And so the church, they do a lot of, they bought it because they do a lot of, service for the community. So they have a senior facility, a daycare, an urban, a farm. They do like, food, and then they have their chapel and all that. So they were deciding, what buildings would come down and how they're going to transform. That's why, and so they hired an architect. And I'll say this, I love architects. I respect them because they defy gravity. Like this would be falling on my head. Like they understand structures, they understand things that we don't. And often I have to tell architects, we understand things that you don't. Water doesn't run uphill. Well, anyway, but anyway, so I have great respect for them. But, they're really great at buildings, right? Although they are getting more and more, sometimes we complain they're stealing our work. They are thinking about the environment more, which is really good, actually. So they have this architect, and in the master plan that he started doing, he put so some of the old seminary buildings they tore down, and he put new church, and there's a very Olmstedian circular drive, right, with a green in the middle. So he tore that out. This is just on paper, and turned that into a big parking lot. Anyway, two things happened. The church didn't realize that it was an Olmsted site and that they could get recognition as it being an Olmsted site. And then also they didn't quite understand if you wreck the physical landscape, it's no longer an Olmsted site. You can't get recognition as an Olmsted site because you're tearing out Olmsted didn't do the buildings. He did the placement of the buildings and the landscape. So somebody told them that. So they ended up going off for an RFP for a landscape architect. We got that job. And so we did so now the architect is regulated to the buildings, but we got to place them, design, and of course we kept that circular in the green. And then we hired to work with us a really great firm called Biohabitat. And because, there was this ravine, particular landscape. So, we really wanted them to look at, okay, so how do you restore this landscape? And what are the things that we need to put in this master plan so they can understand? And how do we deal with, because they were, another thing, there's this wonderful ravine, and they were thinking about like, we'll fill that in and put a, so we really needed, their kind of ecological expertise. So I'm really proud of the master plan. It's finished. And, I think like, the things that we did, the, keeping of that drive and the location of the buildings. And then another thing, because of course, the church is like, well, you're getting rid of the parking lot. What are we going to do with we have to have the parking there. So we ended up putting a garage, and it was great because we put a green roof on top. So that was really nice that they can, use. So, and then, Biohabitat did a really great job in terms of, thinking about what that, the prairie landscape that was there, historical. And then we did all this, gave them all this information about Olmsted and the history of the site and why, if they don't have to tear down any more buildings, they shouldn't, and why the site plan preserves the landscape and doesn't fill in the ravine and all those things. So I'm really proud of that.
And I think that's also part of the power of site narrative, historical context,
Yes.
using that as your driver. It's and then layering on that modern context, programmatic needs, all of that, but trying to keep those relics of which, if we don't preserve them, they disappear forever, right? Like people
Yeah.
don't.
And getting people to think of because it's easy, to get people to think of buildings as history, but to think of landscape itself as history, that was really important. And we did engagement, of course. And the people that live around it, the ones that don't even belong to that church, they use the site, right? They walk the trails, or the trail, there's like a loop trail. And now because of the keeping of the ravine, we build these kind of trail bridges that we can travel across them. So they were really excited to like have the landscape preserved so that they can enjoy it. But still, we were able to fulfill the program that the church needs. But you're so right. And often though, it's just hard for people to see the historic importance and nature of landscape. And that's kind of some of the stuff I'm doing in my research, is like looking at historic landscapes and how they can help us today with our issues.
And just a quick note on the Olmsted is like, what's fascinating is that he got it right. so long ago, and now it's this community amenity, right? That people have been using. So yeah, I'm totally curious. What's your research now? What are you focused on?
So academically, but I'm actually, it's kind of nice that more and more, I think the lines are coming closer together because there are a lot of firms now that do research, right? And a lot of academics who are doing things in the built world. So making those connections is becoming, a lot easier and accepted and acknowledged that yes, academia and practice need each other. And and
Yeah.
then we can solve problems together. So I've been doing this research. So I wrote this article in Places, and now I'm trying to do my last revision for this book I'm writing on Maroons who were, say, self-liberated slaves who went to live in the United States. They ended up living in wetlands like the Great Dismal Swamp or the Louisiana Central Wetlands, which is what I'm talking about. And across the world, they lived in like in like the Amazon, the rainforest and the hills in Jamaica or in Brazil, in
Mm.
rainforest and hills. And so they created communities. And actually, in some of those places, like I visited Jamaica, there's a maroon community that's still there up in the hills. So there were these people that made these communities. And so I'm looking at how they lived within the wetlands and how we can use that for a coastal restoration. So
Ah.
that's what my book's about. But I actually came across, well, actually, somebody at Common Ground, which there are many really wonderful organizations in Louisiana and landscape architects that are working on coastal restoration. And then this one group, the Central Wetland Restoration Collective, one of the groups in that collective read my article that was in Places about the Maroons, that the book, if I finish it, is based on. They said, I've read this article about the Maroons and we're doing this wetland restoration and we really want to, figure out how we can use that to really connect with people. So like they did, they held like this pilgrimage. It was really cool to like go into the wetlands and bring people, where these maroons settled to tell this story. And then so now, I'm working with them, to like figure out if taking that action will actually get people to support the restoration. Like, so they take people on their plantings, right?
Mm.
When they go in and, replant grasses and cypress and things. And so they, want to know if this knowledge would actually encourage, if they could use this knowledge about these communities that lived in the landscape that they're trying to restore and the techniques, if they can use that to get people to be stewards and to join them, in these
Okay.
restoration projects. So that's what I'm working on now. It's kind of cool because I
Well,
got to do the pilgrimage, and it's really wonderful to research and write about something, but then actually to see that like become like this physical action is pretty neat.
and then also thinking ahead into the future and create stewardship of land
Yes.
and really just extending that timeline, but embedded in that
Yeah.
cultural history.
Yes, because, I want this to be like a model. Like, so if it was any landscape, each landscape has a history, right?
Mm.
So if you can get the people that live in or near this history to use that history to help motivate them to help solve whatever the landscape problem is, that's kind of like what I hope, people see this as kind of like, this model of like how you can use the history of, an existing landscape to help solve its problems.
For sure. Yeah. And is that something that when you're on these walks, and with students, is that something that comes up a lot in the narrative? Is just like trying to get people to really focus on that part of the conversation?
Yeah, to understand, because often, like we teach two history courses here. I teach one of them. I teach the latter one. And to get them to understand that really history is about the future, right? Because things have been done, other landscape architects have done things that have happened in landscape. You can utilize that to move forward. You can utilize it as inspiration for current problems that you're trying to solve, design problems, or to outreach to people. It's a way to make a connection, if it's their history, motivation. So yeah, so like history is really a way to tap into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also just want to call out, I know that you've been an integral part of the ASLA Climate Action Task Force and planning. There's all these goals for 2040. And
Yes.
so I think it's just so cool that you have all this historical, cultural relevance, but then you're layering on this next launch in the
Mhm.
profession. It's super.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm really glad that, so I was on the 2022 task force and they asked me to be on this one. And I think it was a challenge at first, like figuring out like, how does equity really fit in? And I think in this latest version, we did a really good job in really saying that equity is really about it's kind of justice framework we use. So, it's really about in terms of climate action, it's really about where do these things happen, right? So it's this kind of
Yeah.
like spatial kind of justice. And then it's about like who's making the decisions, right? So making sure that the community that's being impacted is part of the decision making, right? And also, what are the tools like? So yeah, looking at the other thing is okay, looking at what has been done before, right?
Mhm.
And you look at that, so like maybe what has been done before it wasn't good, and you don't repeat the same mistakes, or
Yeah.
maybe what is done before was good, right? So
Mhm.
using kind of this justice framework to look at equity in terms of climate action. So that's kind of the piece I worked on, but touches all the parts, the biodiversity part, the advocacy part, you know, the climate action, tools and techniques you would use, so thinking that you want to think about equity in this justice framework in all kinds of actions that you're taking regarding climate.
Yeah, that's one of the underpinning elements. Like even
Yeah.
though you have very long, very clearly laid out document, it's all fuzzy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So would you say I'm curious, like, is there something you find that's like lacking in professional practice or academia or things that we should be reconsidering more at the forefront?
Yeah, I think that it was kind of like, what I was like talking to you a little bit before this about the fact that things, the issue with academia is like, the way it's structured, like things happen for a semester and then you move on. But I think it's accepting that things take time and they evolve. And sometimes they go backwards. It depends.
Not linear.
But, you know, it depends. There's so many influences, right? So, I think because, we're in a profession where, something is supposed to be built and there it is, right? And the goal. But I think we kind of have to kind of ease up from that a bit, that it might not get built right away. And even if it's built, it's not really built, right? Because there are things that people, um, you know, economic, social, and cultural factors that are going to change things. I even think that happens with buildings. Often
Oh,
uses change, who owns it, all kinds of things happen. But particularly with landscape, I think buildings sit in the landscape, everything's within the landscape. So I think, adjusting to the fact that it's an evolving thing. I know, you do a set of construction documents and you say, yeah, it's done and there it goes, but that is not really the reality. And I think academia, it's hard for us to deal with it because, yeah, like the student has to do a final design, so that you can have a crit. But, but if we can, it's not final, right?
right.
Because the world doesn't work like that. So
Yeah.
I think that's something we need to address better, right? Even like, so, in engagement, we always say the community, but there is no such thing as the community because communities evolve. If you take one piece of landscape, like a neighborhood in Chicago, there's probably been 10 different ethnic groups that have lived in that neighborhood, right?
Yes, like
Yeah, yes, yes. And you just have to, so there is no the community, right? Even if, you're in the, because communities have different factions. And I always say, like, who do you mean? Like when students say, oh, I talk to the community, like for their thesis, like who? Like what?
Mhm.
Who, because they're different people, especially now, like there's the old community and maybe the gentrifying community, or there's you know, the
Yeah.
past ethnic group that lived there and now the new ethnic group that lives there, right? So there are many communities within the community. And that's part of that evolving thing. So I think if we grasp, and I think that's hard in American culture, right? Because we're so much about the thing, the final thing that's built, the design that we can, you know, if we grasp at these things, that it's really fluid, more fluid than we want it to be, I think.
Yeah, I think it's hard in our very capitalist, billable
Yeah.
hour driven society where you need to accomplish a thing and
Yes.
it's all
Yeah.
so much more dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah. And wouldn't that be more exciting if we'd accept that? And then we'd have to think differently. Yes.
I love that. Just continuing to expand and evolve our minds as we continue. I mean, it's a practice, right? We're
Yes, it's
practicing.
practice. Yes. Academically and professionally. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess what's like in the next, let's say 5 or 10 years for you? Is there a vision of more that you'd like to focus on?
I want to go paint.
Hmm.
I have all this stuff in my brain now. When I was in art school, like they said, you're great, but there's no, I got a lot of stuff in me. So I'm ready to go paint. In terms of landscape architecture, I'm actually finishing up this chapter. So they're Routledge, the publisher. So they have a landscape architecture companion. This is the second edition. And so they asked landscape architects from around the country to write a chapter. So I was honored to get asked to do one of those. And so I'm doing my
Congrats.
revisions, but it's about land ownership. And it's funny because I was having a debate with Austin about that. And
Yeah.
I was saying that nothing in America is unowned. And he said, there's public landscape. I'm like, yeah, but even public landscape has rules. Like, I cannot go and build my house on Central Park between those lovely rock outcrops. I would love, even though that's a public park, right? Like it's not like in Brazil where people can go and build favelas. That's what they were. They were land that people can claim. You can't do that. I mean, people can't even claim underneath the freeways. They kick out the homeless who try to build under, you know, which is a public right of way. So my argument is there is no unowned, uh, there's no free land. And then how do how do communities who don't, so that you really do have to own land to really impact it, and then how communities can deal with that in order to you know chart their own destinies if they don't,
Absolutely.
or how do they, yeah, so that's what I'm writing about, and it's kind of interesting, and it is kind of, like I said, I'm getting pushed back in some quarters, but if you know me, pushback just makes me,
Field of the fire. Well, community design process, right? Like it's
yeah,
yeah.
so that's what I'm working on, and yeah, and in the practice, I mean, like I guess like a lot of the government contracts and things are kind of slowing down because of changes. Actually, like most of our, we haven't been that impacted because most of our work was from small communities that were getting funded other ways. So that's been kind of good. I mean, it slowed some, but not. We're still there, and a lot of these communities, they've lost their government funding, but they're trying to get private funding and other kind of resources.
For
So
sure.
so yeah, but we like that kind of work. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to the power of community, like true grassroots organizations and efforts
Yes,
will continue, and now they're rising up because they have to,
you have to.
but they're part of the power of the community in each of the community. That's
Exactly. Yeah, the power of community.
very cool. Yeah, so I guess, kind of a last thought here, given all of your accolades, accomplishments, your very long evolving resume that'll have painting up next on it, um, what advice would you offer to others or a younger version of yourself?
Would I offer advice to people entering landscape architecture, or
Just, yeah, it could be landscape architects or the community at large. Sorry, the community at large.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. So I think one thing, is to admit you have fear. You know,
Oh,
and then you can kind of overcome it. Because, sometimes you have to be fearless, but you can't be fearless until you know that you can kind of say, okay, yeah, I'm really afraid there's going to be pushback, or this is going to be hard, or so once you do that, then you can just kind of, go ahead and that you make, because I've made some mistakes, like, oh gosh, like I had a project that was torn out, like because that yeah, anyway. So you just you gotta have to, like, yeah, like, learn from those mistakes, but don't let that, you know, get get you down. But I think, if there are things that, like, you believe in and are excited about, and things that you believe in, then it's easy to say, okay, yeah, I'm afraid to do this, but I believe in this and I want to do this. And like, I've been really lucky because there have been so many people that have helped me. I was really, and so that's another thing I think, advice is that, yeah, that you really aren't, and it sounds so corny that you're not alone, but are, but yeah, there are people, nobody does this um alone. I mean, there
mhm.
are well things I wouldn't have gotten to do unless somebody said, "Oh, you should, talk to Diane," or "I can't do it. Let ask her to do it," or, you know, "I think that's really great what you're doing. Like, how do I help you?" You know. So
Yeah.
yeah, like don't be afraid to accept that. Because I'm really thankful. I mean, I could name names. There's so many people that really helped me and gave me opportunities I would not be,
Mhm.
had those experiences. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's informed your whole journey,
Yes.
and it's all community driven, but you're part of this design community, the academic community. You're working with other communities. You're talking about the stories and the dynamics between that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Diane.
Thank you. It was fun. I like to talk. Even though I always tell people I'm shy and they say, "You're not shy," but I really am. I'm not good in crowds. I'm not a good mingler. But if I'm one on one with a person, I will burn their ears off. I think a lot of people are like that. Like they don't do good in groups, but if you get them talking because they've been quiet so much. Yeah. So
Yeah,
thank you for allowing me to chat, talk with you.
absolutely. Thank you so much. How can others best connect with you? How do people find you?
Oh, so you can go on uta.edu, like there's a profile there, like you could put faculty profile if you want that. Or yeah, and then my email address at the university is diane.allen@uta.edu. And if you go to www.designjonesllc.com is my website, the firm's website, and you can see the work we've done, and also my email address is up there too. Yeah.
Okay, sounds great. Well, yeah, everyone definitely check out Diane, get to know her. And thank you so much for taking the time. This is very inspiring and can't wait to get out there and be part of all these communities, make some
Thank
impact.
you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much,
Bye.
Diane.